Well, good afternoon. I think it's a privilege to be in this session and to be able to present this short discussion on the police effectiveness, accountability, and violence in Nigeria. What I try to do in this presentation first is to analyze the contemporary pattern of violence in Nigeria. I think that is basically on the news everywhere you go, people asking you. And I sort of think that one of the problems is Boko Haram, the current insurgency movement, is overwhelmed the general pattern of violence in Nigeria, and it's possible to have a better understanding by looking at the variety of violence in Nigeria. And then, of course, to briefly discuss the effectiveness and accountability of the police force in Nigeria in relationship into the kind of violence that we have. Try to conclude also by looking at what is often forgotten. Luckily, Lawrence Sherman is here. Used to be popular in the 80s, people concerned about violence against the police. Very often people are only concerned about police violence against the citizen, but rarely these days do people really talk about violence against the police. Before we came in with Adam, we're talking about human rights, and where the military are at the war front, people don't remember the kind of danger they also face relative to the military, the insurgent group. And the monitor is the monitoring of the military, not the monitoring of the activity of insurgent, because so we sent to empower the insurgent and disempower the military by some of the international codes that we have. So those are the kinds of issues we relate. I start from what, again, probably generational. I think in the 80s, many of us who were students in those generations were probably looking at the connection between police and power. The link between police and power. Basically, police is a means by which the state exercises its monopoly over legitimate violence. So when you talk about police being violent, it's not that they're using force, they're using violence. It's the context in which they are using it, the authority with which they're using violence. So we need, again, in talking about the police, to be conscious about their intrinsic linkage to power. Then, of course, their powers, obviously, are intrusive and constraining in terms of the rights and responsibility, rights and freedoms of citizens. Not only do we have them between police and power, they're also intrinsically related to violence. I think that point was made as early as 1953 by Wesley of the role of violence in policing. So again, I try to argue that they are responsible. The linkage can be understood in these ways. They are responsible for preventing and controlling violence. So the police primary duty is to prevent and control violence. But they are also empowered to use violence. And then, of course, sometimes they are the perpetrators of violence. Other times they are victims of violence. And ultimately, police are established as a means by which the government or the state exercises legitimacy. That, again, here, try to look at the relationship between effectiveness, accountability, and violence. Try to point out, and I think some of the discussion yesterday raised some of these issues, was to say that whether police is effective or ineffective has relationship with violence. Where police are effective, they are less likely to be violent. But where they are ineffective, they are more likely to be violent. Then you find that when police are not accountable, of course, we have abuse of police powers, and that, of course, may fuel violence against the police. Again, lack of trust in police often derived from the conduct of the police itself, but not necessarily related to effectiveness. I think what you find in many data is that confidence in the police, that is approval of police effectiveness, is distinct from trust in the police. These are two dimensions of police, and I think it's very nice that even in policy we try to understand what is it that promotes the two different aspects. So you may find a police that is approved, but it's not trusted, and that's what we have in Nigeria. You find a fairly good rating, approval rating for the police in Nigeria in terms of the work they are doing, because people take into consideration the context of their work, the resources available to them, and of course some other factors. But when it comes to trust, it's based on the character, on the conduct, on the integrity of the police, and there are two sides of different dimension in the measurement. So I said legitimacy of the police is largely dependent on the legitimacy of the government. The legitimacy of police is actually derived. The police cannot have a legitimacy in a state where the government itself is not legitimate. So that's another constraint we find in Nigeria. Then we find, as I said, the more democratic a society is, the more accountable and effective the police system is very likely to be. But in saying that, one must be very careful. If you look at different phases of the police, even in developed society, you have the problem. Lawrence Sherman this morning was talking about New York police. Historically, I think New York police was probably the most corrupt police. Historically, you can imagine, you find people who done the study over from 1894, consistent, is it about 6 different kinds of investigation into New York police up to the 1994. So, but over the time, the more democratic society become, the more likely the police will become more accountable. Then, of course, the strategy when you want to reduce the police should pay more attention, if you want to reduce more, not on the police, but rather on the political, economic, social, and organizational structure that may prevent or generate, trigger, or mitigate violence, and then entrench impunity, or otherwise, in terms of strengthening rule of law. So the police integrity is dependent, that's the point we are making, is dependent on the political context, is dependent on the economic context, is dependent on the social context. That's not to mean that the police does not, cannot influence their integrity. So you may find a setting in which, to a large extent, you may find a discredited police in the context of a legitimate government. The only difference is that that will not exist for a long period. It will not be institutionalized. Then for Nigeria, we try now to summarize in terms of types of criminal and collective violence. Yesterday, I think somebody was arguing whether we can differentiate between collective and individual violence. I think there are reasons that we could do that. Because when it is collective, people know this violence is derived from religious or ethnic and the rest of them, and is separated from instrumental violence on an individual basis. In Nigeria, most of the factors driving violence will be what I have listed, the competition for resources. It may be couched in different ways, in terms of religion, in terms of ethnicity. Basically, this competition for resources by different groups. And then, of course, struggle for recognition and participation, which basically play out at the level of politics. Of course, inequality in power and wealth, especially in a very corrupt society in which access to the state is one of the principal means of gaining power and means of gaining wealth. Then, of course, in such society, exclusion of groups from power and resources society meant that you've been excluded from resources. Then we have weak and incapable governance institutions. There's a major constraint in Nigeria. When the current crisis started at the escalated level in 2009, every major incident, the president comes out and said, don't worry, we're on top of the matter. And Nigerians laughed. The previous episode had not been investigated. Nobody's been arrested. Nobody has an explanation. And everyone up to the UN building, he said, no, we're on top of the matter. You will deal with the people. Are you going to deal with the people you have not ever arrested? So that's a major. Then I think the capture of the state by group or groups. The state is virtually captured by some group and the others are resisting. So in such society, police not independent. Here I've used the data from National Crime Victimization Survey conducted by Clean Foundation. This is the 2012 survey. It has 11,518 from a nationally representative sample. And I just bring out the violent element there. The second column relates to victimization of household members. The question asks if any member of the household other than the respondent had been a victim of any crime in the course of the year. And the second column is among those who said they were victims was to tap what kind of crime they were victims of. about. And then, of course, you find robbery, domestic violence, and then physical assault are the major form of violence. Then the last column is, the rate or the percentage relative to the total population, the total sample. So the third one is with respect to group that reported victimization, which was 24.8% of the total population sample of 11,500. And the last section is in relation to the overall sample. Then, of course, we also try to tap from public what they consider to be sources of violent conflicts. They are within the state and within community. We ask them what were the major sources of conflict within their state and within their communities. One interesting thing is that political and election disputes were the most cited in both community and the state. But in some other places, there are actually discrepancies. So you find at the state level, the conflicts tend to be generated on a higher level by religion, because at that point the state authorities are using religion as an instrument of manipulation. Then, of course, the land ownership had some prominence at the level of community, and traditional rulership also had some salience at the local level. Now, what I've tried to do is to paint the picture of the seriousness of violence in Nigeria by citing some episodes. You find between 1994 and 2004, the Odua People Congress, an ethnic militia belonging to one of the ethnic groups in Nigeria, was very prominent. In 2000 alone, a House of Representative committee found that 55 violence incidents were ascribed to that group, and that resulted in the death of 163 civilians. 7 of their members were killed, and 9 police officers were killed by the group. That followed by Niger Delta, again, militant agitators and insurgents. Again, we do not have any reliable number for that, but it lasted over 6 years at very active phase, and took many dimensions. Again, you see the various kind of activity associated with it. The Kaduna Sharia riot in early 2000, government report investigation showed that 1,295 people were killed in a spate of just 2-3 days in that episode. Then, of course, in Jos, which had encountered quite a lot of these, you find 2001, 2008, 2010. In 2001, about 904 people were identified in government reports, then 302 and 12 and 412 in the other years. All these are from government reports in terms of authenticity. Then, of course, an attack on one of the communities, 109 were killed. Again, that's from a police report. What I'm emphasizing, that will be the least in Nigeria. Government reports are usually an underestimation of the real figure, and that's the point I'm emphasizing. Then, in one of these central states, a cult last year killed 70 security officers in just one day. They laid an ambush for them, killed 10 state intelligence officers and about 60 police officers. Till today, nobody has been prosecuted for that killing. Then, of course, Boko Haram insurgency 2009 to present, thousands have been killed. I think that is in the media. So in Nigeria, when we talk about effectiveness, what will be the problem relating to its ineffectiveness? And a number were noted, the separation of police as non-people's police, but rather colonial police, the lack of fundamental reforms after independence, the long military rule meant that police was not, as an organization, was not equipped. And then, of course, we also note the absence of coherent philosophies and then proliferation of parallel security agencies. So these are part of the numerous reasons for its ineffectiveness. Again, we try to provide information about public perception because Nigeria State Police, as at now, has no reliable means of performance assessment because even job schedules are not available. So there are no targets and no police plans, so you can't measure. So a public opinion a survey will be one. So you find about 58.59% said police were doing a good job. Again, we find that those who were experienced victimization the previous years, before the survey, actually had different view from those who were not victims. So victimization actually influenced perception of work of the police. Then we also find that those who say there decrease in crime in their community also were more satisfied with the police performance than those who perceived increase in that. I just mentioned about 59% had said police were doing a good job. Now let's see trust. That's why I say there are two different dimensions. Only 8% of the police said, the respondents said they trusted police a lot. And 41.2% trusted them only a little. And then, of course, 27.5% did not trust police at all. 63% of the respondents said most or all of the police were corrupt. However, when you ask people who had contact with the police in the last 1 year whether they were solicited for bribe, about 1 in 3 said indeed they were asked to pay bribe before service was delivered. It's interesting that perception of corruption is much higher than is actually the case when you have contact. Nonetheless, this is a very high figure. Then, of course, now I talk about violence by and against the police. I just use a quick statistics of police armed robbery because you find 1,043 citizens were killed in armed robbery incidents. Then 16,925 suspects were arrested. Well, about 2,216 robbery suspects were killed in their encounter with the police. And then 517 police officers were also killed by the robbers in those encounters. I think it's about a ratio of 1 to 4.5. I think old criminology also tried to use that ratio as to whether there is an excessive force. If robbers need to kill 4 before you kill. But the argument against that is as a symbol of authority to kill 1 is a very serious matter. And the ratio that will not work. But matter Huggins tend to argue about those ratios. So a major problem of effectiveness is only 20% of the robbery suspect arrested during the period had been prosecuted. Yesterday we were talking about certainty of arrest, certainty of conviction. Then, in terms of accountability, we argue that the police are generally accountable for what we call 3 C's for crime. That is their performance or effectiveness. They are responsible for their conduct. They are also accountable for the cost, efficiency, and resource management. In Nigeria, of course, they are also responsible to internally to discipline and performance evaluation department. They are responsible to external agencies like the executive, legislature, and judicial bodies, and to civil society. In Nigeria, we have a long list of police accountability. If you talk about the agency, Nigeria has probably one of the worst in terms of our regulation of the police. But thank goodness, none of them works. So you find that at the highest level, you have the police council. The president is the chairman, the president of the country, and then all the governors of the state. And of course, that has hardly met in the last 15 years that we're back under civil rule. Then, of course, you find and it's supposed to be responsible for the organization, administration, and then general supervision. And then you have the legislative committee, the judiciary, and the rest of them. An important particular one is the Police Service Commission, which has responsibility for appointing, dismissing, and exercising disciplinary control over all police officers except the Inspector General of Police appointed by the President. Again, this is a commission. The commission exists, but basically it lacks both the resources, expertise, and the capacity to hold police accountable. In terms of discipline in the Nigeria police force, yes, there are attempts to have some mechanism for discipline. They are very weak. And from 2009, which is the last published report of the Nigeria police force, these are the kinds of statistics you get, which is, again, problematic. This should be read as affecting mainly senior police officers. The senior police officer's disciplinary procedure is carried out under the civil service. So the procedure is laid out. For junior staff, it's an orderly room trial, and the records for it hardly go beyond the orderly room trial itself. And unfortunately, these are the the large number of people with whom the maintain contact with the public. Again, these figures make no sense. I mean, they are just fractions of whatever may be happening. But I think what I presented, because of the complaint, the types of complaint, not necessarily the figures. So you find abuse of office, brutality and assault, corruption, criminal force, extortion, extra-judicial killing, harassment and intimidation, homicide, murder, threat to life, torture. The important point here is that these probably numbers could be multiplied by 1,000, and you probably won't be wrong. But you can see the range of the kind of conduct that we have. So in concluding, I simply know that Nigeria is witnessing very pervasive and growing level of violence. And the upsurge must be understood in terms of the social, economic, and political structures. And the failure of governance has fueled crime, divisions, and violent conflicts in the country. The police lack the capacity to face the current security challenges. The military have been deployed to carry out, undertake civil policing, which of course are further worsening the capability of the police, because once you rely on the military, you are not developing the police to do its constitutional duties. And of course, we also now try to offer these just that the root cause of violence in Nigeria is bad governance. And I think we've had quite a lot of that from yesterday evening. And that in any attempt, you need to promote democratic transition. As I said, the police itself is dependent on the character of the political system. I think we need to develop public trust in the police by reforming the force in terms of its intelligence, investigation, prosecution, and civil relations. People just don't trust the police, they will do the right thing. But part of lack of trust or the principal major reasons has to do with their corruption rather than the lack of it. I think pressure from the civil society on the Police Council and Police Service Commission will be necessary in order to improve on police accountability. Again, finally, we suggest that adoption of multi-sectoral approach, that is working with families, school and health authorities, rather than simply enforcement approach, will be one way by which the police can contribute to reduction of violence in the country. Thank you.